A big story that's caught my eye is the fact that the Metropolitan Police Federation, that's kind of like the union that represents Met Police Cops, well, they were doing a big survey of all of their members and asked them what they think about the Notting Hill Carnival. Feels like a million years ago now, doesn't it, in the depths of winter. But at the time when it was taking place, we spent a lot of energy discussing it. And I've always thought that it's a ridiculous thing that it's allowed to just happen in residential streets, and it's just full of illicit activities. Well, apparently 90% of the police officers surveyed who responded said they felt unsafe working there. 28.78%, so that's well over a quarter, had actually been assaulted when working there. One officer said the police operation was overstretched, ineffective, and an exercise in self-torture. Another said they would rather crawl naked through broken glass. 2 million people flocked to the streets of West London over August bank holiday to enjoy Notting Hill Festival. Well, 90% of Met police officers do not. Let's speak now to Norman Brennan, who is himself a former police officer. Norman, I mean, we've discussed this before, haven't we? The fact that it's just basically a criminal fest now. It'd be a nice thing if it was just floats of a carnival, some good food, you know, some nice music, and everyone just rubbed along together quite happily. But there's constantly stabbings, 3 fatalities this time, and yet you can't criticise it. You know, 90% of police are saying it's like a war zone, but you're not allowed to criticise it, are you?
Well, you can criticise it, and I'm probably Britain's lead independent spokesperson on policing, so I tell you exactly what the truth is. Nobody pulls my strings. I recall the last Notting Hill Carnival I policed, and I policed many, both as a uniformed officer and as a detective, and my last call on my last Notting Hill was to a man with a firearm at a petrol station in Harrow Road. Now, as you rightly say, there were 8 stabbings. I think there were 2 murders. You say there were 3. One was stabbed to death, a 32-year-old mother. A 41-year-old was kicked to death. They both died. The mother, in fact, lost a leg before she finally succumbed. 61 police officers were assaulted. There was gun crime. It's out of control.
What about that young chef? Wasn't there a chef who worked over in Dubai who had come over and turned up at the Notting Hill Carnival and was killed as well?
Yeah, that was the 41-year-old that just on the perimeter. The thing is, what happens is, Alex, and I know it because I've policed it, is that a number of crimes committed on the peripheral, normally at the latter part of Monday night. Monday night is the dreadful time that we look at. And the ones that are on the peripheral are normally pushed away so it doesn't make the figures look any worse. But I recall often that we used to be preventing gangs. We followed them all over the transport systems, and we had to send officers to all the different stations and areas, so one gang was not allowed to stab, murder and cause mayhem with another gang. And that's what we were doing behind the scenes. And then, of course, you see what happens on the scenes. I personally dreaded it. Most officers are pulled into it against their will. They're given rest day working, which is the only incentive. And we hope and pray that we end up in one piece at the end of it and can go home to our families without being stabbed or injured ourselves. It's a dreadful day. We don't enjoy it. It needs to be cancelled or moved. We've reached that point.
But the thing is anything going to come as a result of this? Because every single time anyone tries to criticise, well, not even criticise, just point out that it's a stab fest rather than an enjoyable family occasion. And how about you move it to a contained area like Hyde Park, where you could have tickets and weapons inspections and all the rest of it? I mean, for blimmin' heck's sake, if you wanted to go to a Taylor Swift concert, you're going to have a shakedown more than if you wanted to go to the Notting Hill Carnival. And that, to me, just beggars belief. But you can't do anything or say anything about it because all of a sudden you're framed as being a racist. The organisers will say, oh, well, you know, this is xenophobia, this is racism, it's a lovely cultural event. And you've got all one side of the argument going, isn't it great? Look at all this. It's, you know, cultural enrichment. And the police are saying it's a drug fest. It's a stab fest. You've got people being violently assaulted, sexually assaulted, including police officers. Do you think anyone's going to actually listen to this survey by the Metropolitan Police Federation? Do you think the Met Police themselves will listen to this and then go to Sadiq Khan and say, game's up on this one, we just won't do it anymore?
Probably not. Yeah, I know the chair of the Met Federation. I know him very well. And police officers are entitled to their view. Unfortunately, as you rightly say, it's predominantly a black-related carnival. And it's nothing wrong with telling the truth. I also give a voice for victims and public safety. I have done for 35 years, including when I was a serving officer. And if these stabbings, shootings, muggings, attacks, possession of weapons, guns and knives and attacks are predominantly committed by young black men, why can't you tell that if that's the truth? And I'm telling you, having policed them and following all of the carnivals and often doing interviews afterwards, that the crime is predominantly committed by young black men. They ruin it for all the others. And sadly, sometimes there are those that commit crime and make these situations, and certainly carnivals, so dangerous when the head of the Met Police and even the carnival organisers themselves must understand it's not organised properly. It takes 7,000 officers for both days, costs £13 million. I think that money and those officers could be put elsewhere, policing the streets of London where they're tugged away from their boroughs to police this, which, as you rightly say, most of them cannot stand it. They don't want to police it. They're assaulted. People are murdered and stabbed. What statistics are enough to say enough's enough?
Indeed. They're talking about statistics. Apparently there's a poll that's been conducted by the Opinion for the Centre for Social Justice think tank, which shows that 66% of police officers think the use of cannabis is basically permissible now. There's no point going after one person smoking weed. You'd have to go after the whole lot of them. And it's happening everywhere. And frankly, I would tend to agree. You can't walk through London without getting sort of passively high in the sort of downdraft of someone else's cannabis haze. And it's just become so normalised now. Do you think this has got connections as well, in that sense that you can't, as police officers, police the small things anymore in case it sort of upsets community relations?
You're right. I live in Twickenham, and the streets of Twickenham, I'm ashamed to say, stink of weed. And it does. The stench is awful. I don't like it. Even round where I live, in the block of flats I live, there's been a letter sent to all of us that there's a stench of it, and I often smell it. I'll be quite honest with you, Alex. What the situation is even when I was in the police, there was hardly anybody that we stopped and searched that didn't have a bit of cannabis on them. And often, if they were decent and cooperated, weren't rude, and there wasn't more serious offences, I'd put that bit of drugs down a drain and give them a verbal warning. If we arrested everybody in possession of a small amount of drugs, I'm afraid you would never see a police officer on the streets. And even at this moment, you and I rightly would know that we rarely see a police officer on the streets now. We are in a mess as far as law and order is concerned, and the caveat here is that Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper this week are going to come out with another load of old nonsense about law and order. Well, I'm an independent veteran on law and order, 46 years of policing and campaigning, and what I see of this government, I utterly despair. They haven't a clue on any single crime, and all they're doing is putting a elastoplast over gaping wounds. And we all know that if you don't go in, treat and neutralise and stitch gaping wounds, they fester and they become very serious, leads to sepsis, and what happens then?
Yeah, rot in the system. Bit like the broken windows policy. You've got to go after the small stuff. It ends up being antisocial. I wonder whether these respect laws that the Labour Party were talking about bringing in will make any difference. Only time will tell. Norman Brennan, thank you ever so much for joining me.